If cancer risk could be cut almost in half by something done every day, would that be ignored or taken seriously? Because that is exactly what the data suggests in certain populations over 60, and yet almost no one explains it this way. In clinical practice, the pattern is not dramatic. It is quiet. People feel fine. Energy is stable. Routine does not change. Then something shows up unexpectedly. A scan, a lab, a diagnosis that feels disconnected from daily life. And the first question is always the same. How did this happen? Because nothing obvious felt wrong. That is the misunderstanding. Cancer does not begin when it is detected. It begins long before that point, at the level of the environment inside the body. Small changes, repeated over time. Inflammation that never fully resolves. Cellular stress that is never fully cleared. Repair systems that slowly lose efficiency. That is where the process starts. And what determines that environment is not one decision. It is what happens every single day without much attention. Now here is the important part. There are specific daily habits that consistently show up in people who maintain a more stable internal environment over time. Not perfect, not immune, but more protected. And what is often missed is that these habits are not extreme. They are foundational. But the order matters, because if the first layer is off, everything built on top becomes less effective. So instead of looking at this as a list, think of it as a sequence, a system that either supports the body or slowly works against it. Let's start with the first layer, because this is where most people underestimate the impact. Hydration. Not how much, but when. After the age of 60, the signal for thirst becomes less reliable. That means the body can remain underhydrated without awareness. And that has a direct effect on one of the most important systems for long-term health. Cellular clearance. Every day, cells produce waste. Damaged proteins. Byproducts from normal metabolism. That waste needs to be cleared efficiently. When hydration is low, that process slows down. Not enough to feel, but enough to change the internal environment over time. And when that clearance slows, inflammation begins to rise in the background. Chronic low-grade inflammation is one of the most consistent conditions associated with long-term disease risk, not because it causes immediate damage, but because it creates an environment where abnormal cells are more likely to survive. Now here is where this becomes practical. After a full night of sleep, the body is already in a mild, dehydrated state. That is the moment when hydration has the strongest effect, before coffee, before food. Because once caffeine enters the system first, fluid balance shifts in a different direction. So the sequence matters. And most people reverse it without realizing. Coffee first, hydration later. That small reversal changes how the system stabilizes for the rest of the day. Now think about this carefully. How often does the morning begin without water at all? Just routine, just habit. Because that one decision is not isolated. It becomes the baseline for everything that follows. And once that foundation is corrected, the next layer becomes significantly more effective. Because what enters the body after that point determines how inflammation and cellular signaling continue to develop throughout the day. And the next piece is something that used to be common in daily diets, but is now often missing completely. And that absence changes how the body regulates inflammation at a deeper level. Now layer 2, and this is where the internal environment starts to change more noticeably. Fermented foods, not as a trend, not as a supplement, but as a daily signal to the immune system. Because after 60, the gut barrier becomes less selective. Small gaps allow bacterial fragments to enter circulation. The body responds with low-grade inflammation that never fully shuts off. That background signal matters because it changes how immune cells behave. Cells that should identify and remove abnormal growth become less precise. Now here is the key mechanism. Beneficial bacteria produce short-chain fatty acids, especially butyrate, when they ferment fiber. Butyrate supports the lining of the colon and sends signals that help remove damaged cells before they become a problem. When fermented foods are absent, that system weakens. Not immediately, but progressively. And most people never connect fatigue, digestion changes, or subtle inflammation back to what is missing in the gut. Question becomes very practical. How often does a day include any naturally fermented food at all? Not flavored yogurt loaded with sugar, not processed substitutes, but real sources with live cultures. Because frequency matters more than quantity. A small serving daily is more effective than large amounts occasionally. Now tighten this further. Timing and pairing amplify the effect. When fermented foods are combined with fiber from vegetables or simple prebiotic sources, the beneficial bacteria have fuel to sustain themselves. That changes the microbiome in a more stable way. Without that pairing, the effect is temporary. This is why many people try it briefly and stop. The system was never supported long enough to adapt. Now connect this back to inflammation. When the gut barrier is supported, inflammatory signals drop. When inflammation drops, the environment becomes less favorable for abnormal cell survival. That is the link. Not dramatic, but consistent across data. Now here is the retention point most people miss. Removing one irritant is not enough if the protective layer is not rebuilt. Cutting sugar helps, but without restoring microbial balance, the baseline does not fully normalize. That is why progress often stalls. Now ask this directly. Is there a daily input that actively supports the gut, or is the system left to compensate on its own? Because once this layer is in place, the next shift becomes much more powerful. Movement. But not random movement. Specific intensity, specific duration. Because how the body uses fuel during movement determines whether the internal environment supports or suppresses abnormal cell growth. Now layer 3. And this is where the shift becomes visible in how the body actually uses energy. Walking. Not casual movement, not short bursts. Sustained, moderate walking that changes how fuel is used at the cellular level. Because the body runs on two primary fuels, glucose and oxygen. Most cells can use both. Abnormal cells rely heavily on glucose and are far less efficient with oxygen. That difference matters. When walking is consistent and long enough, circulating glucose begins to drop. At the same time, oxygen delivery to tissues increases. That combination changes the environment in a very specific way. Less available fuel for abnormal cells, more oxygen in the surrounding tissue. Not a cure, but a shift that works against growth. Now here is where most people get this wrong. Duration and intensity are either too low or too inconsistent. A short walk does not create the same effect. The body needs time to transition into that metabolic state, usually 30 minutes or more at a steady pace where conversation is possible but slightly effortful. That is the range where glucose utilization increases and oxygen delivery stabilizes. Now add the second mechanism, mitochondria. These are the structures inside cells that produce energy. After 60, both number and efficiency decline. When mitochondrial function drops, cells become less efficient and more prone to dysfunction. Sustained walking signals the body to create new mitochondria. This is called mitochondrial biogenesis. It is one of the few interventions consistently shown to improve cellular energy systems without medication. Now connect that back to the internal environment. Better mitochondrial function means more stable energy production and less cellular stress. Less stress means fewer signals that promote abnormal growth. Again, not dramatic in a single session, but consistent over time. Now here is the retention point. Timing amplifies the effect. Walking earlier in the day, especially before a full meal, increases reliance on stored energy. That deepens the metabolic shift. If walking always happens after large meals, the body stays in a different fuel pattern. So, sequence matters again. Hydration first, movement second. That pairing compounds the effect. Now consider this carefully. How often does walking happen with enough duration and consistency to actually change metabolism, not just movement for routine? Because that distinction determines whether the benefit stays surface level or becomes systemic. And once this layer is in place, the next input becomes even more influential. Because now, the body is primed to respond to specific compounds that directly affect gene expression and cellular defense systems. Now layer 4, and this is where the science becomes very specific. Certain vegetables do more than provide nutrition. They activate internal defense systems at the genetic level. Cruciferous vegetables, broccoli, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower. These contain compounds that become active when the plant is chopped or chewed. One of the most studied is sulforaphane, and this is where the mechanism matters. Sulforaphane activates a regulatory pathway that controls hundreds of protective genes. These genes are involved in detoxification, antioxidant defense, and repair of damaged cellular components. After 60, activity in this system declines. Not completely, but enough that the margin for error becomes smaller. When that pathway is less active, the body becomes less efficient at correcting damage before it accumulates. Now here is the detail most people never hear. The compound is not fully active in the vegetable as it sits. It is created through a reaction that depends on an enzyme released when the plant structure is broken. That means preparation changes the outcome. If the vegetable is heavily cooked immediately, that reaction is reduced. If it is chopped and allowed to sit briefly before light cooking, more of the active compound is formed. Small detail, significant difference. Now connect this to what has already been built. Hydration supports clearance. Gut balance reduces inflammation. Walking improves energy use. Now this layer activates cellular defense. Each one builds on the previous. This is why the order matters, because without the earlier layers, the response here is weaker. Now tighten the focus further. Frequency matters more than volume. A moderate portion regularly is more effective than large amounts occasionally. The body responds to consistent signals, not spikes. Now here is the retention point. Many diets include vegetables, but not consistently from this specific group. Variety is good, but certain categories have targeted effects. This is one of them. Now ask this directly. How often does the week include these vegetables in a way that allows this pathway to activate consistently? Because without repetition, the signal fades. And once this layer is in place, the final piece becomes the most powerful of all. Not because it adds something new, but because it determines whether everything discussed so far actually works. Recovery. Specifically, sleep. Now layer 5, and this is where everything either holds together or starts to break down. sleep. Not just duration, but quality and timing. Because this is when the body runs its most important repair systems. During deep sleep, the brain activates a clearance process that removes metabolic waste that accumulates during the day. At the same time, the immune system shifts into a more active surveillance mode. Cells responsible for identifying and removing abnormal growth increase activity during these phases. That is not a theory. It is a consistent finding across multiple lines of research. Now, here is what changes after 60. Deep sleep becomes shorter and more fragmented. That means less time in the phase where repair and immune activity are at their highest. At the same time, production of melatonin declines. Melatonin is not only involved in sleep regulation, it also functions as an antioxidant and plays a role in how the body responds to abnormal cells. When levels are lower, that protective effect is reduced. Now connect this to everything before. Hydration supports clearance. Gut balance reduces inflammation. Walking improves metabolic control. Nutrient signaling activates defense pathways. But if sleep is fragmented, the body does not fully execute repair. So even with strong inputs during the day, the system does not reset properly at night. This is why progress sometimes stalls even when multiple habits are in place. Now tighten the focus. Consistency matters more than perfection. Going to sleep at different times each night disrupts the internal clock that regulates hormone release. Light exposure late in the evening suppresses melatonin further. Eating close to bedtime shifts the body into digestion when it should be in repair mode. Each of these factors alone seems small. Together, they change how effectively the body recovers. Now here is the retention point. Sleep is not passive. It is an active biological process that determines how well every other system functions. Without it, the benefits of the other layers are reduced. With it, those benefits are amplified. Now ask this honestly. Is sleep treated as a priority or as something that happens after everything else is finished? Because that choice determines whether the body completes its repair cycle or carries unresolved stress into the next day. And once this final layer is stabilized, the full system begins to work as it was designed. Now, bring all of this together, because this is where most people misunderstand how prevention actually works. It is not one habit. It is not one food. It is not one decision. It is how these layers interact every single day. Hydration sets the baseline for cellular clearance. Gut balance stabilizes inflammation. Walking shifts how the body uses energy and improves oxygen delivery. Cruciferous vegetables activate internal defense pathways. Sleep determines whether any of those benefits are fully executed. When even one of these is inconsistent, the system compensates. When multiple are off, the environment begins to shift in the wrong direction. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily. That is how risk builds, quietly, over time. Now here is the part that matters most. The same process works in reverse. When these inputs are aligned, even gradually, the internal environment begins to change. Inflammation decreases, cellular repair improves, metabolic stability increases, and body becomes more effective at managing abnormal changes before they develop further. This is not about eliminating risk completely. That is not realistic. This is about shifting probability. That is what the data consistently shows. Now think about how this applies in real life. Not everything changes at once. One layer is corrected, then another. Each step makes the next one more effective. That is how the system is rebuilt. not through intensity, through consistency. Now, here is the retention point that most people miss. Waiting for a symptom means the process has already been developing for a long time. Prevention works before that point, when the body is still responsive, when systems can still adjust. That is the window where these habits matter most. Now ask this directly. Which one of these layers is currently the weakest? Because that is where the most immediate impact will come from. Not from doing everything perfectly, but from correcting the first limitation. And once that shifts, the rest becomes easier to build. I'm Dr. Olivia Kesson, a cardiovascular surgeon with over 20 years of clinical experience, and I can tell you this with confidence. The body almost always gives you signals before something becomes serious. The key is understanding what those signals actually mean. See you next time.